This won't be the first time I say it, I assume, but I'm looking for questions rather than statements when it gets to that portion. I think that's everything from me, and without further ado, I'll hand over to our first panellist. And our first panellist is Robbie Moore, MP for Keighley and Ilkley, and the Shadow Minister for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, as well as being a member of SEN's Parliamentary Caucus. Over to you, Robbie.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I hope everyone's settling into conference well and enjoy the next 3 days. So I was lucky enough to be asked by Rishi when he was Prime Minister to join the department and became a Minister for Water and other issues to do with waste and resources, recycling, back in November last year. And why? Because I pitched for that job. Because in my constituency in Keighley and Ilkley, we've got a very active campaign group that are on the phone to me regularly to do with water quality. And in my constituency, we have the River Wharfe, which was the first river to be designated with a bathing water status. So it matters. And we made a huge amount of traction in government, and particularly when the latest team took the helm in the department under Steve Barclay. Through our plan for water, we brought forward a huge range of accelerated measures. And let's remember that the plan for water was about more investment, stronger regulation, and tougher enforcement on those who are polluting our rivers. And in the time that when we were in the department, for more investment, we unlocked the River Wye Action Plan, which was £35 million being dedicated to that. We made sure that money that was being taken off the water companies that pollute is ring-fenced through the Water Restoration Fund to make sure that it's being put back into improving water quality. And we also made sure that we're tackling things like nitrate and phosphorus runoff in terms of making sure that those in the agricultural sector were supported through a £74 million slurry infrastructure grant. But we also knew that when it comes to understanding the complexities of pollution, you've got to monitor it. You know, back in 2010, only 7% of storm overflows were actually monitored for water companies. That now sits at 100%. And if we don't know where pollution is taking place, we can't enforce and allocate the appropriate resource to deal with it. So we wanted to take a much tougher approach with those that are polluting, which is why we removed the cap on civil enforcement penalties from 250,000 to an unlimited amount, which is why we announced banning water company bosses' bonuses, which is why we also announced linking dividends to environmental performance for those who do pollute. So we did do a huge amount of work in this area in terms of specifically addressing improving water quality, but there is still much more to do. And I want to get into the discussions of what the new government is doing. Because I do not think, through the amount of emphasis that the Labour Party put on this issue in the run-up to the general election, that the new piece of legislation that they've introduced, the water bill, the Water Special Measures Bill, is not going anywhere near the amount of not tackling the amount of emphasis that the Labour Party put on this issue before the general election. And there are holes in it. And I would like to get into some of the detail in that when we get on to discussions. So pleased to be here, really keen to take as many questions as possible on an issue that I deeply care about in terms of improving our water quality.
Thank you so much, Robbie. And next up, we have Rebecca Smith. Rebecca is the newly elected Member of Parliament for South West Devon and also another member of SEN's Parliamentary Caucus. Go.
Hello, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you very much, Kitty, and really good to hear what Robbie's just said. And it's worth saying that there was a tweet that Robbie did, I don't know, in the last Parliament that got shared and was a massively helpful source of argument back to our opposition during the general election. That was generally my source book of what we have done. And I think what he's highlighted is what we did do under the last government was an enormous amount. And I think one of the challenges we're going to have going forward is highlighting that action that we did versus the lack of likely action that we're expecting Labour to see. I have to slightly probably disagree with what Kitty said in terms of water being the most seismic issue from an environmental perspective, because in my constituency, I have to say, it didn't really come up during the election. I was waiting for it. I was kind of expecting to have to go large on it on my kind of campaigning material and social media, and I don't think I'm not sure I even did a post on it during the actual main general election campaign, because it just wasn't coming up as a big issue. It came up as an issue in the wider sense, and we were one of the local beaches that received the new designated bathing water status. So again, something that we did as the previous government. Mothercombe Beach in my constituency was one of the ones that under the last MP succeeded in that. But I think that highlights to me how we've got a new cohort of people that we have to be appealing to, which, you know, I live in a coastal community, it's a coastal constituency, and swimmers are the kind of new thing that I suppose in the last 10 years, if not the last 5 years, it feels like a bit of a post-pandemic thing, doesn't it? You know, people have suddenly become aware of water in a way that I think they weren't before. So we've always had those, given the number of rivers in my constituency and the kind of rural aspect, we've always had those who are passionate about ensuring that our rivers were clean, but now you've got a whole load of consumers who are wanting to swim and who probably didn't know what it used to be like, but know what it's like now. So they've got no way of gauging how bad it might have been 20 years ago. They just have this expectation that the sea and the rivers around them should be like a swimming pool at times. And obviously we've got to get from, you know, we've got to manage people's expectations whilst also highlighting what we're doing. So from a political perspective in opposition, I think that's going to be key. How do we help people understand what position we've been in historically, where we're at now, which is vastly better than where we used to be, and help them call the new government to account to ensure that the progress that we made as government over the last 14 years continues. So I suppose there's the climate change issues, there's the agricultural side, which I know we're going to touch on, which I'm really interested in. And the other bit, I suppose, how am I doing for time? Just to say is I've got a rural-urban seat, so 2/3 of my constituency is actually urban, and we're getting that urban creep. So we're having to build new towns, we're having to build new homes. The new Labour government want us to do even more of that. If they're not talking about water and they're not talking about sewage in the way that we think they should, they're not prepared to fund our farmers to look after the land better. How are we going to deal with all this new housing that they're ultimately expecting us to stick in the countryside? So I think there's a whole load of questions, and I'm assuming this will be the beginning of a conversation that lasts over the next couple of years. But those are some of the issues that, particularly in the southwest, we're looking at. I get the benefit of doing that compared to the national picture, I suppose. So yeah, I think population growth, climate change, all of those things are very real, but we can be really pragmatic going forward and highlight our record and hold Labour to account, I'm sure.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Next up, we have Guy Thompson, who is firstly no relation to me, but welcome, Guy. Guy is the Group Sustainability Director of Wessex Water and Managing Director of N-Trade, a trading platform that connects businesses and farmers to fund nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Chair. Let me just briefly characterise what I think see the three components of the challenge, and then touch on what I think the solutions might be. First and foremost, we have an environmental challenge. The other speakers have already touched on this. It's actually, when you look at water, it's not just about water quality, it's about water quantity as well. We've got massive challenges around providing water resources for a growing population, unsustainable levels of abstraction in many catchments, and of course we've got a multifaceted challenge. So water pollution comes from a range of sources besides treated wastewater from water companies, agriculture and urban runoff, most notably. And I'd say river health, the river health challenge, which has obviously rightly been given a huge amount of prominence in the media of late, is just symptomatic of a wider challenge we've got around how we get to grips with our nature recovery commitments. Some very ambitious targets set out by the last government in its 25-year environment plan, codified in the environmental improvement plan. I think a lot of work to do to get our head around how we're going to drive the investment required to deliver those targets. Secondly, an investment challenge. There's a growing finance gap between the commitments that the UK government has and a range of governments across the world, in fact, and the availability of public and philanthropic funding to actually deliver those commitments. There has to be an opportunity and a need to incentivise the private sector differently to enable an efficient and innovative transition to a nature positive and net zero economy. And the water companies, the privatised water companies in England should be at the forefront, very forefront, of demonstrating what good looks like in that regard. Taking what was a very outdated, I think, utility model from where it began, driving private investment in new infrastructure to where it could be, working much more closely with local communities to deliver benefits to local places and customers in their patch. Thirdly, a regulatory challenge. If you try to design a system to drive efficient investment in environmental improvement, you couldn't have come up with a less efficient system than the one we currently have. This needs fundamental reform, and I think the current approach we've got to environmental and indeed economic regulation will not deliver the type of ambition in the 25-year environment plan. We need to overcome the problem we've got with fragmentation of rules and regulations to apply to different sectors in a catchment, the very siloed approach taken by different regulators, the very prescriptive approach actually, which constrains and inhibits innovation at the coalface. And we need to move from that to a much more systems-based approach to how we regulate. And then very briefly, because it's very evident to me, the system we have is not fit for a 21st century challenge. Growing population, climate change, and indeed the growing expectations of the public that Rebecca's just touched on. What are the solutions? In the short term, the government's committed to a rapid review of the environmental improvement plan. I think that has to be an opportunity to adopt some more shorter term targets to drive investment certainty and how these long-term targets could be delivered. And indeed thinking about how we can adopt those targets at a local level to enable sectors to collaborate and enable more partnership working in delivery at a local catchment-based level. In this Parliament, Steve Reed's committed to the review of water regulation over and above the fairly tactical measures he's taken on board to date. And that's a massive opportunity to think about how you can drive much more cost-effective investment in the long-term solutions to our water quality and water resourcing challenges, and fundamentally the long-term financing and maintenance of the infrastructure that will be required over time. And lastly, the opportunity, I think, to think about how we can establish high integrity markets that bring together the actors like farmers and landowners in a catchment to collaborate with a whole range of businesses that may want to invest in nature-based solutions and other approaches to delivering nature recovery and mitigating climate change in their patch. Without that type of approach, I think we could have a very different approach to how we regulate for water quality from 2030 onwards, which will require water companies to step up, but a whole range of other actors in turn. So, over to you.
Thank you, Guy. Next up, we have Emily Hunter. Emily is the policy lead on land use at the Woodland Trust, and today is representing the Sustainable Nitrogen Alliance, which is a group of environmental, public health and climate-focused organisations offering solutions to the impacts resulting from excessive nitrogen use and pollution.
Thanks, Kitty. So I obviously for the Sustainable Nitrogen Alliance, I'd like to touch a bit on the problem of nitrogen, what it does, and maybe some of the solutions. And at the Woodland Trust, I lead on our agricultural policy, so I'd like to talk a bit about what we can do to help farmers address some of these problems. So, sadly, it's become a well-known fact that the UK is one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. Our soils are increasingly degraded, our rivers are polluted, and our health is impacted by noxious gases and particulates. And the way we use and waste nitrogen is one of the key drivers of this harm. So both nitrogen and phosphorus are essential to life on Earth, and nitrogen gas actually makes up 78% of the air that we breathe, and in its inert form, it's harmless. But through our ability to create synthetic nitrogen, humans have raised concentration levels well above natural levels. So fertilizer manufacture, burning fossil fuels converts nitrogen into reactive nitrogen compounds. So when we talk about nitrogen pollution, we mainly mean these reactive compounds, so nitrates, nitrous oxides, and ammonia. Recently, the spotlight has, as we've heard, been really on sewage polluting our rivers and seas. But while sewage is a huge factor in water pollution, the most widespread source of failing river health is caused by the runoff of fertilizers and manure into our rivers, which can cause dense algal blooms and choke rivers that suffocate wildlife and plants. So only 14% of England's rivers are currently in good ecological health. And nitrogen-based pollution also contributes to climate change, ozone depletion, air pollution, soil degradation, and acidification, and connected human health and biodiversity impacts. For example, nitrogen pollution is one of the key factors in the poor ecological condition of our native woodlands. The sources of these problems are the animal housing, storing and spreading manure, slurry, fertilizers, and sewage and burning fossil fuels, whether that's from industry, transport, or in our home. And it's not just an environmental problem, it's an economic issue for farmers as well. So in the UK, almost half of the nitrogen fertilizers that are applied to land are wasted, mostly through runoff into our rivers. And that means around £400 million a year is lost just through nitrogen being leaked back into our rivers. So improving our use of nitrogen is not just a climate and environmental issue, but it can be at the heart of a just and resilient agricultural transition for farmers. Many farmers and growers are already taking action to drive nitrogen use down and efficiency up, but we know that much more can be achieved if the financial and technological support is available. So the way that farmers are farming now has very much been driven by the incentives that have been offered throughout the 20th century. So we now need those incentives to support farmers to move to a more sort of nutrient-efficient use way of farming. We also need to level the regulatory playing field, rewarding those taking action while holding polluters to account. Traditionally, policy is focused on reducing the flows of nitrogen into rivers, so trying to reduce that runoff, rather than cutting those inputs, so reducing the amount of nitrogen used in the first place. But nitrogen is a complex issue. It's not just about agriculture, it's not just about sewage, it's not just about transport, and it needs a sort of government-wide approach. So we need to break down those silos and take an approach that maximises those synergies and minimises pollution swapping. So at the Sustainable Nitrogen Alliance, we're calling on the government to measure and model the flows of nitrogen through the UK environment, creating balance sheets of various scales. And then these should inform a cross-departmental strategy for using less nitrogen more efficiently, recycling it better in agriculture and cutting emissions so that we have a chance of hitting our nitrogen targets. The UK has also committed through the UN Convention on Biological Diversity to halve the loss of nutrients to the environment by 2030. But our statutory national targets are less ambitious than that. And we know that the policies we currently have in place are unlikely to meet our national targets, so we're definitely not likely to meet that international target by 2030. So we'd love your support in Parliament, both in highlighting this important issue and in pushing for some of the win-win opportunities that are already in development. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but by no means least, we have Willie Athill, who is the CEO of Norfolk Seaweed and a WWF project partner.
Can I borrow your mic?
Yes, sorry.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Hi there. Yeah, I'm Willie Athill, and we are seaweed farmers and oyster farmers up on the North Norfolk coast. And where we live is a place of exquisite beauty, where we have the land meeting the sea. The catchment area we've got there is 2 rivers coming in, going through some of the most agricultural parts of England, entering the sea. So we've got the Stiffkey and the Glaven rivers. And so everyone talks about river water quality, but river water quality is directly connected to the sea water quality as well. We are growing seaweed out there as for biostimulants, and we're in the 2nd year so far of testing on field trials on a large Norfolk estate to see whether we can reduce the amount of synthetic fertilizers that farmers are putting on their fields in the first place. And so at the moment we're working with spring barley, but we'll be going on to potatoes and sugar beet later on. Spring barley, so we're looking, last year we looked at about 15% of a saving, where if we can make a 30% saving is our sort of goal. Whether we can get there, I'm not sure. But anyway, these spring field trials will go on for probably 3 years. What we're doing to do that is growing seaweed at an offshore site. We're about 3 miles out. And so we've got a license from the MMO, the Marine Management Organization, to use the seabed. This is an exhaustive and expensive process to get that, but we've got it. And then we go to the Crown Estate, to get the lease. And when we've got the lease, which we've got on this seabed, we can then pilot our project. And so, as I say, we're in our 3rd year at the moment on that. Crown Estate has been absolutely amazing, and MMO, not quite so. But having said that, they've got to go through the hoops. They've got to put us through the hoops, because it's a very new industry. In fact, it's a completely novel industry, growing it. And so we've got to prove that we're not going to do any damage. And that's crucial to us, because the overarching desire that we're after is that we will increase the biodiversity in the bit of water and the seabed that we're working with, because we think that there's an enormous amount of value in that sort of in natural capital, in getting a biodiversity net gain. And the only way you can do that is to study that bit of seabed and that water column. The baseline data has got to be absolutely acute to start off with before you go into the project. And then as you go along with the project, so you keep monitoring, and you see what you're doing. And if we're getting a wonderful gain, then we can extrapolate that out across the southern North Sea, and we've made some extraordinarily good thing. So that's where we're at the moment.
Thank you so much. And I think before I hand over to you, but please do start thinking of your questions, I had a few of my own using my power as the chair. Farming has come up from a few panellists so far, and as I think the party of the countryside, the Conservatives occupy an interesting position on how best to approach the role of farming in its at least current state towards water quality. I wondered, Robbie, if you would like to talk through what the previous government did in terms of environmental land management schemes to help with the issue of water quality, and where perhaps the gaps are that the new government should be looking at.
Yeah, okay. So we all recognise that landowners, land managers, farmers have a absolutely unique role in being able to improve water quality, but also soil health. And as we came out of the Common Agricultural Policy, we were able to develop our own schemes that specifically paid through subsidy-based arrangements farmers to do just that. So I worked as a farm business consultant before being an MP, and one thing that really frustrated me was when you were entering into a contract as a landowner with Natural England, for example, you were just dealing specifically with your own land holding. And one of the great things through the land management schemes, the ELMS programme that we developed as a government, was we were able to look at three different levels effectively. Sustainable farming incentives, countryside stewardship schemes, but also much bigger catchment-wide approaches through land-based catchment areas, which enabled effectively all landowners within one catchment to enter into the same arrangement that then collectively had much positive impact in producing not only soil health but also water quality within that catchment. So it enabled us to use tools to provide specifically subsidy-based schemes to improve water quality. We also were able to specifically put money into improving slurry storage and making sure through the slurry infrastructure grant, which we put about £74 million allocated to that in the last government towards the end of the last financial year. And also we were able to incentivise practical specific capital improvements on farm, like putting in concrete where it was previously hardcore. So we were making sure that runoff any runoff from ammonia from slurry storage or where muck was being stored was able to be collected appropriately rather than being able to unfortunately be leached into the watercourse system. So there's been lots of little mechanisms that we've introduced over the last government. But what I would specifically like to say to the new government coming in is that the farming budget is incredibly important. And the rumours of the farming budget being reduced by 100 million per annum will have huge negative consequences on the amount of subsidy that is able to be put into these improvement measures that we announced previously and were able to put in place as a Conservative government.
Thank you so much, Robbie. Guy, I wondered if you wanted to come in perhaps with your end trade hat on to discuss the potential financial opportunities for farmers.
And I build on that. I think ELMS, full credit to the last government for having decoupled area-based payments and enabled the public funding for public goods regime to come in through ELMS. It's an important step in the right direction. Clearly, the farming industry has a very important role to play in enabling an efficient response to the nature recovery challenge. And indeed, I think its contribution actually could play an important part in providing the revenues required for farming industry to be sustained as a multifunctional, thriving industry in our landscapes. the question, I think, is what ELMS is for. And I think that is, at the moment, we're sort of drifting towards the creation of another static agri-environment scheme at the expense of the opportunity, I think, to use ELMS as a tool, which is enabling a fair and just transition to a system of agriculture that can be properly integrated with other land uses, nature recovery included. And I think I go back to my previous remarks about other sources of investment going into a landscape, the public funding flowing into, for example, flood risk management schemes, highways authorities, and how they deal with runoff, and regulated expenditure by water companies. These are all sources of investment that could be channeled into different and more innovative solutions that farmers could be at the forefront of pioneering. And then lastly, wearing my end trade hat, I come back to my remarks about the opportunity for a real market to be created to drive the private investment that reflects the growing, I think, appetite by corporates to deliver their regulated obligations and voluntary obligations, actually, as they start to get better understanding of the impacts they are having on nature through their supply chains, to channel some of that money into investment in local places and to utilise that through a better regulated and governed market, which can enable a fair use of that investment for both those businesses' needs and also farmers and land managers on the ground. Massive opportunity. At the moment, we're drifting, I think, towards a very binary focus on how do we get house building off and deliver better quality environmental mitigation. That misses a massive opportunity to create this much bigger, more holistic approach to creating that market.
Thank you, guys. Would you like to come in, Emily, on some of the policy gaps that the new government perhaps should be focusing on when it comes to agriculture and water?
Can't hear you.
How about now? There we go. Emily, would you like to come in on perhaps some of the policy gaps that the new government has on this particular topic?
Yes, so I think everything that's kind of been said already is true, and it is really positive, I think, that what the previous government put in place around the ELM scheme, where we pay farmers for delivering public goods. And sort of what we've got so far is certainly promising. I think there are gaps. There's to move to a sort of way that we describe, where farmers are farming in a more nitrogen efficient way, using the kind of what's available more efficiently and farming in more with nature rather than against nature. It's quite a big change for a lot of farmers. And as I said, the way that people farm now has been driven by the subsidies we had before. So we really need subsidies that drive the opposite. And the sustainable farming incentive is in place, and it's got some sort of promising things. There's a nutrient management standard within that. But it's probably not ambitious enough yet. And at the moment, we don't have that middle bit. So we've got the landscape recovery scheme, which supports sort of groups of farmers on much larger landscape scale change projects. And then we've got the sustainable farming incentive, which is the entry level, something where it's meant to be things that every farmer can do anywhere. But for those farmers who want to do more, those high level options aren't there yet. And I think we were supposed to hear more about that in July, but then the election was called, and now we've got the new government. We haven't heard anything yet. So certainly in our sector, we're waiting to hear. And I'm sure farmers are as well, because it's hard for them to plan then to say, well, should I go into the sustainable farming incentive, or is there something more I could be doing in the higher tier? And then I think another really big gap is about that advice and guidance for farmers. So some of the things that we are asking farmers to do maybe aren't that complicated, but some are. We're talking about farm level nitrogen budgets, for example. And there are farmers who do that and do it very well. But, when I talk to people about it, I think it's complicated. So, we're asking people to do quite complex things, and they really need that advice and guidance. And I think at this point, perhaps you need to kind of maybe front load some of that investment to get everybody up to that standard, so that then it becomes more sort of common practice. Farmers can see their neighbours doing it and think, oh, well, I'll do that too. But obviously, Robbie mentioned the budget, and that it's a really good point that we don't know for certain, but we are hearing rumours that the budget's going to be cut. And I mean, actually, within the environment sector, we've been saying the budget needs to be increased to at least $6 billion a year. So certainly cutting it would not be good for farmers, and it would not be good for the government or the environment in the long term, because if you invest that money now to help change the way people farm, so they're farming with nature, to help, for example, farmers do things that are going to improve soil health and prevent runoff into our rivers and clean up our rivers, we've got more chance of meeting our targets and less likely to then to have to pay large sums of money later to clean things up. It's similar to kind of we need to help farmers now adapt to climate change rather than giving them money to help them out when there's been floods or a drought or something. So I think there's a really important point about the budget that we need to invest that money now to help farmers, and a lot of that needs to go into giving them that advice and guidance so that they can change the way they farm in a way that works for them and for their business as well.
Absolutely. Rebecca, as a newly elected Member of Parliament, how will you be approaching this in the new Parliament?
I mean, one of the things that I get to do, I suppose, as a new MP is speak up for the farmers that are in my constituency, and in the campaign, and now as that elected person, you know, I believe it's incredibly important to actually be talking to them because they're the experts. You know, I'm from the town side of my constituency rather than the rural side, although, you know, I've obviously lived next door to it for a long time. I think for me, what's been touched on that is important to remember is that I think often we forget that farmers are basically the private sector. You know, these are innovative businesses that over generations have adjusted to the climate, but also to the things that are thrown at them by the government of the day and the opportunities that are available to them. And I'm always blown away by how innovative they are. And I think that's a key skill that they have. And we can learn a huge amount from them, actually, in terms of the flexibility that they've shown. And so I think one of the things that I will be looking to challenge, I guess, going forward is just making sure that this new government doesn't change the goalposts for them, because, you know, we've had to change the goalposts as a result of Brexit, but they've barely got used to ELMS and all of those new systems which were put in place with all good intentions and are beginning to show some good fruits. The catchment area plan, I think, is particularly important. I know there's a number of estates in the constituency where I represent who are working together more, probably as a result of that kind of piece of legislation and those policies. So I think it's going to be really important for the opposition to ensure that we speak up for our farmers, make sure that they're given half a chance to be able to actually implement these policies, because all the farmers that I meet, or the vast majority of them, care deeply about the countryside. They care deeply about the environment. They want to play their part. And I think we've got to hold that in tension with the fact that it's going to be very easy for the kind of pro-keeping the water as clean as possible side of the argument to vilify farmers if we're not careful, because, you know, even in the southwest we know that 46% of the pollution in rivers that Southwest Water deal with, for example, comes from runoff, but that doesn't make them the bad guys. That's just because they've been doing their job, and we're now so much more aware of the damage that we've got to mitigate against. So I suppose from my perspective it's going to be defending farmers, ensuring that they get given half a chance to actually implement these new things so that they can have thriving businesses that provide us with food and us with that biodiversity that we're all looking for, and ultimately a future and a country that we all want to live in.
Absolutely. Positive words there, Rebecca. And on the topic of innovation, Willie, I know you spoke about some of the barriers you've been facing, and I wondered if you wanted to talk through any more and how we can get more farmers embracing seaweed as an innovative product for water quality.
Yeah, the farmers want to find a solution completely. So we've found we're in North Norfolk that you build the science first, and then you build those supply chains, you build the science, and you go to the farmers. You give them a solution. The farmers open their arms and love you. And so we found that we did build that science. We got together with the UEA, University of East Anglia, we got together with the John Innes Centre, and then we went to Holcombe Estate, you know, who's not only friends, but, I mean, it's a big estate. It's a big, powerful estate. And we said, here we go, this is what we'd like to do. WWF came in with us on this and partnered us on this, and sort of tied it all together. And so there we were as a seaweed farmer out there on the sea, and oysters. And we want to try and grow something within 5 miles of where it's going to be used as a huge benefit. So the carbon footprint is minute, and where it goes is into those wonderful chalk streams that go back out onto the sea through this wonderful bit of land. The innovation comes with the gathering of the info, and it also just comes with a desire to make the place that you've inherited better when you leave it, when you pass it on, not worse. That's the that should be our aim completely, and I believe it's looking like it's possible. You know, we've just started an incredibly exciting and rather ambitious project, which is putting 4 million oysters down in an oyster reef on our sea farm. You know, we won't be able to do that alone because we're a small family business. But I bet you that we will start getting people in quite soon. They will see, 4 million oysters will filter. They do 200 litres of water a day per oyster. You tell me maths, guys. I'm a farmer. It's a lot of water they're filtering. I'm talking thousands and thousands of tons of water, hundreds of thousands of tons of water a day. So these little things, how you guys probably didn't know that an oyster filtered water, and so you now know. Just need to tell people and get the science on it, vital the science, because everyone says, oh, you haven't got the science, won't believe you. So get the science, go to people, talk it up, and get it done. And then hopefully you raise some money, because it costs.
Fantastic.
But sorry, that's it.
Okay, I will now open the floor to questions. I'll take 3 at a time, and a reminder that I'm looking for questions, not statements. The man at the front with the white shirt.
Thank you very much.
The microphone's just on its way.
Thank you very much. Name's Ian Hollidge from East Sussex, and Sally Ann Hart was a former MP down in Hastings, where we had some massive issues with sewage into the sea, which is misinterpreted by the public and used against us on electoral campaigns. I was interested in what Guy was saying about if you were inventing a system, you wouldn't invent it as it is now. And we do have problems down here dealing with the different authorities, Marine Management Organisation. The work that you did in monitoring was excellent. However, the Southern Water Beach Buoy gives out information when it is a pollution risk, and the public misinterpret that into a pollution incident. Do you think that was or needs addressing in some way? The other question, I've got 4. The other question is about water supply. And Ofwat, I believe, this December are going to give some of the water authorities permission to increase the prices. And the water, in my opinion, is undervalued at the moment. And I think we should try to encourage the rates of water supply to go up. Would you agree that that's the right way to fund new infrastructure? The other point that we have is that...
I'm going to stop you there because that's very cheeky of you. But please may you pass the microphone to the person sat behind you. Thank you.
The exam question for this session was, is there a distinctly conservative approach to take? I wonder if the panel could answer that.
And the final question, Alyssa here on the second row. No, the lady in front.
Thank you. So I'm Councillor Alyssa Swinglehurst. I'm Chair of the River Wye Nutrient Management Board and a Herefordshire County Councillor. Quick update, the plan for the Wye disappeared without trace, delivered absolutely nothing. The previous government, I believe, was going to ring fence water company fines for river restoration. That money's now going into Treasury. Have you got any comment about that? And then finally, the OEP have said in their letter to Steve Reed on the EIP 23 rapid review, they identified limited capacity for reducing water pollution without both changes to current agri-environment schemes and changes to the regulatory approach. Given the issue with farming rules for water not covering off phosphates because of guidance 2.2, what would you see the change in regulatory approach being that might be helpful?
Thank you so much for those questions. I will come to each of you just for a few of them rather than everybody answering the same question. The first thing, I suppose, Robbie, on communicating sewage-based information. I know that this is something that comes up quite regularly. Is there a better way? And then maybe Guy as well from a water company.
Yeah, okay, so I would definitely say that we have to have the data. So increased monitoring is incredibly important. But so I think that was a step absolutely in the right direction, because it enables not only water companies but also the regulators to take either investment or enforcement against those who are polluting, and also should create more awareness. Now, the point on awareness is really key, because this was a common theme that was raised constantly when there is more data in the public domain about what is the risk, or then what is actually the pollution incident that is taking place. And I think the real challenge has been, because there has been so much campaigning on this particular issue, that any risk that is highlighted through increased monitoring is deemed by everybody to immediately be a pollution incident, and it absolutely isn't in most cases, actually. And therefore, I think that comes down to making sure that there is a clear clarity on what data is being presented and what is being put into the public domain by not only the water company, but how regulators, particularly the Environment Agency, are presenting that data. And there needs to be absolutely much more clarity on that. And that was something that I was trying to raise with the Environment Agency when I was in the department, because bathers need to have the right information, but because it impacts everybody, not only bathers, but the local economy, that are then sometimes suffering as a result of a risk being identified when actually it's not a incident. And also that also then feeds into the challenge of when you're dealing with water runoff or excessive rainfall, as opposed to it being sometimes an actual pollution incident from a water company. I just want to pick up, if I can be really cheeky, on the River Wye point, just because I think this is really this is a real frustration. So I know. In the run-up, so when we were in the department, we made loads of announcements. So, £11 million was allocated and ring-fenced for the Water Restoration Fund. This was money that had been taken off water companies as a result of polluting, and should have been ring-fenced to be specifically spending on improving water quality measures, alongside that water company being expected to improve the infrastructure that failed, that caused that pollution incident. And that was an announcement we made, but clearly the new government have not followed it through. The other announcement we made was £35 million being allocated specifically to the River Wye Action Plan. Again, it sounds as if it's just not been implemented by the new Labour government. And another one which I announced was we designated another 27 bathing water sites, which also brought out regulation that said that if a bathing water site had been consistently rated poor consecutively for 5 years, it would not drop off and would still hold its bathing status. Yet the Labour government have not made any new announcement on whether or not they're going to be keeping that announcement in place. And this is really important, because unless those announcements are followed through by the new government, they fall off the radar, as has already been alluded to. But also, they were very good announcements that helped not only improve water quality, but provided a lot of certainty to the campaigning groups that have been campaigning on these issues for a long period of time. And then when we have it coupled with, and I think it would be more than 100 million being taken off the farming budget, that is specifically for improving environmental improvement measures, whether it's water quality, soil erosion, or whatever it may be. That is another indication by the government, by the new Labour government, that they are not going to be taking these issues seriously. And that's what we were trying to do under the previous Conservative administration.
Thank you, Robbie. Guy, did you want to come in on this and also quickly touch upon the water supply question?
Yes, okay, so on the data, yes, we can't have too much data, too many data. Transparency is key. I think we've already seen the benefits of that from the increasing monitoring of sewage, of storm overflows, in increasing people's awareness of the issue and driving the need for a better investment to deal with this long-term solution. But I'd add two caveats to that. I think there's lots of data already available to actors in a catchment that is not properly used and exploited. We need to make better use of existing tools and models to understand better what those data are telling us about where to invest in solutions. And also, secondly, I think, and this applies certainly within water companies, there's a requirement to build up our capabilities in data management, actually, to better use data for much more innovative and holistic approaches. Tools like AI, digital twin modelling, telemetry are all part of the long-term answer, I think, in how we can use big data to drive more cost-effective investment. If I may, I also heard Ian ask a question about the institutional architecture and whether that was fit for purpose, or did I mishear you? Too many bodies was the implication of your question.
The Marine Management Organisation, I believe, issue licences for when works need to be done on the stormwater outfall.
Yeah.
And they tend to take rather a long time to issue those licences.
Right, well, I can't comment on the MMO performance in its licensing regime, but I suppose I was going to reflect on the question about whether what change in regulatory approach is required, and that fundamentally I think is the issue here. I mean, you can argue that the DEFRA arm's length body is crowded. Full disclosure, I was a founding director of Natural England, so I was part of the problem. But I think actually it's the underpinning regulatory framework that needs the attention, because that in turn drives the culture in our arm's length bodies, and it is that pivot to a much more outcome-based regime that gives the private sector investment certainty on how it can be driving investment into delivering these nature recovery targets that I think is the missed opportunity. Post-Brexit, that has to be a massive opportunity for whichever government of the day to take. And I think it's an apolitical question, actually, in which SEN could clearly be to the fore in driving a greater cross-party consensus to match the equivalent cross-party consensus that led to the Climate Change Act. These are apolitical issues that demand attention across the party system.
Thank you, Guy. Willie, did you want to come in on the point on the MMO and regulatory bodies in general?
Yeah, they're slow. But yeah, they're slow. I mean, there's so many other statutory bodies that are having to feed in. Natural England being one of them. That are having to feed in to getting an application or to do work on a storm outflow, for instance. There are so many people, the other statutory bodies, that have to be questioned, and the timing that it takes to, you're given 36 days or something like that to get your question in. They're given 90 days to give you the answer. And they give you the answer normally, and they don't give you the answer, they give the for instance, the MMO. So Natural England will give MMO the answer, MMO will have a little think about that, and then come back to you, and then so it's you could go 6 months to get one question answered. So what it comes to is that puts the onus on you to make sure you apply to do the job where they can't ask a question. So you don't try and flim-flam about. You make sure that you're absolutely honest and transparent in the application, and don't give the statutory bodies an opportunity to say, have you thought of this, which you haven't thought of. And so don't let them do that. So you've got to be really upfront. I learnt that to my cost. And so you come in, you make sure that you give them all the data, all the facts, and data on water quality is a nightmare. I've got eDNA things sucking up water in Blakeney Harbour at the moment. I've got little people going around picking up grab samples to get it studied. Get those done, and then when they say, that was gulls. Gulls went and crapped in the water. You can say, no, it wasn't, it was pigs. And here's the data. And there you go. So it's just facts, science.
Fantastic. Emily, did you want to come in on the need to have a good regulatory environment with getting stuff done?
Yes. So, I think there's always a place for strong regulation, but also regulation that is enforced. And I think that's a big issue, is that our agencies at the moment, so in particular the Environment Agency, don't always have the resources and the capacity to enforce the regulation that we have. So it's not necessarily a problem with the regulation, but with its enforcement. And then I think there's a question about how you enforce it. And actually, under the last government, we did see this move towards more of a because as Rebecca said, the majority of farmers actually want to work with the environment and nature. They are doing their best. So the previous government talked about moving to this approach where rather than just punishing everyone immediately, you try to kind of offer advice and support about what went wrong and why. And I think that's really important. You definitely still need to have those penalties for the ones who are just flagrantly violating the regulation to maintain that level playing field, apart from anything else, for those who are doing their best. But an approach that actually guides people to say, well, actually, you've broken the rules here, but this is why, and this is what you can do differently. And that comes back to what I said about having the investment in advice and guidance. And I think as well as the strong regulation and the support for farmers to do things differently, there needs to be a strategy, specifically on nitrogen pollution. We need to have a cross-government strategy because, as I said, it's not just about farming, it's not just about sewage. And I would really like to see that within this Parliament is at least a commitment to develop that strategy. And I wondered if I could just briefly say something about the distinctly conservative approach, if that's all right. Because I think when you care about the environment and nature, it's easy to feel really depressed right now because it just feels like, whenever we get updates on statistics about birds or nature or water, it's always bad news. But when I talk to colleagues and I'm sort of looking for reasons to be cheerful, one of the things I would say is 6-7 years ago when I started working in this sector, we didn't have the agriculture bill that set into law this idea of paying public money for public goods. We didn't have an Environment Act that set mandatory targets. We didn't have a mandatory commitment to net zero. We didn't have a commitment to have an environmental improvement plan published every 5 years. And so actually, if you're looking for a distinctively conservative approach, I really hope that it will be to be proud of that record and to push the current government to deliver on it and to deliver on those targets and to continue that work rather than perhaps the other direction.
Rebecca, I wondered if you would like to come in on that particular point. I mean, it seems from what Robbie has already said that we've done a lot of good stuff, but it might be going. How can we deal with that in opposition?
Well, I think that's really encouraging what Emily's just said, because I hope there are more people who realise that the last few years have actually seen some real progress. And I think it's incumbent on us to make sure we keep communicating that, as I said at the beginning, in our approach to tackling the new government, is to keep holding up, look what we achieved. Are you going to match that and go even further? So thank you for that, because it's not very often you hear people, I'm sure, say well done for what you did. I think for me, perhaps the distinctly conservative approach that we can follow is, we're ultimately all about taking responsibility, aren't we? And I think one of the things we have done is putting in place those mechanisms to hold people to account, because again, one of the arguments that we kept having to say to people is that actually not that long ago we didn't know how much pollution was going on, and as Robbie said, it's now 100% of storm overflows, for example, are monitored. I think people assume that was already being done, and it wasn't. So that accountability piece is really important. I think there's the responsibility for businesses and farms, etc., to tackle the runoff, the nitrogen, the things that Emily's been talking about. Equally, we know there's the responsibility for water companies, but I think the distinctly conservative thing is not to blame the water companies for what's going on, but to seek to work with them, which again, as Robbie's illustrated, is what we've done by taking those fines that were issued to ensure that we are doing something constructive as a result of their misdemeanours, I suppose. So I think that's going to be really distinctive, is we're more of a carrot than a stick kind of approach, I suppose. And then I also think we've got to remind people that as individuals we have something to do as well. We all expect perfect water, but what are we doing as individuals to make sure that we're not flushing the wrong things, and we're not doing all the things that as consumers we actually are being irresponsible with? And you talk to the water companies and that's what they're having to deal with, is people's bad behaviour. So I think for me the distinctly conservative approach perhaps is that we're about taking responsibility, and with that comes accountability. But as Emily has so helpfully said, it's also about the government providing the support for people to change going forward. So hopefully that was a little sense of a conservative approach to this.
Absolutely, and we'll now have a few more audience questions. Front row.
I'd just like to touch on what Rob just said. Obviously water quality's come a long way in the last 10, 15 years. But there's still room for improvement. I agree with what Rob just said about farmers with the pollution runoff. But it's not just farmers, but you also get like factories what leak pollution into watercourses. Now, as a fisherman, I see firsthand plastics in the water, wet wipes, rubbish, shopping trolleys, and obviously it's demoralising to see that. You know, and also on my part of the world, I come from the Midlands, Severn Trent Water.
Conscious of time, could you get to the question, please? Sorry.
Severn Trent Water are putting in record investment into their infrastructure and fixing leaking pipes. You know, there's still way to go, you know, in leakage and everything like that. So it's right that they're being held to account. Yeah.
Okay, fab. Next question. The man behind. Yeah.
I've got a question really to Robbie. When you had the opportunity to start counting the amount of storm overspills, why didn't you take the opportunity to insist that the water companies actually start monitoring the grey water that they put in as a result of those overspills, or even on a regular basis? And I think this is in the Labour Party's manifesto. Whether we see it or not will be another question. But surely that's a basic, because the Environmental Agency isn't up to monitoring every time there's a heavy rainfall. Thanks.
I think, given the time, we will leave it there and go straight to Robbie for the answer.
No, thank you. So just on the first question, I think the point that is illustrated there is it's really important to take a catchment-wide approach. And I actually think there's an element of conflict of interest in terms of where responsibility lies as water moves through the catchment, because you have farmers that are also land managers that are responsible as it moves through them. When it gets onto highways, you've got the local authority that is then responsible for it, or then the water company becomes responsible as soon as it enters into the combined sewage system, or you then might have the Environment Agency that's responsible for it, or you may then have the Drinking Water Inspectorate getting involved. All of which these organisations, whether they're regulators or an influencer in terms of how policy is made, are all trying to make slightly different decisions about how water moves through the catchment, of which it almost has an implication on the quality, or the negative implications on water quality that move through the system. And I think where there is room for improvement is trying to properly, from a regulatory point of view, and how decisions are made about new infrastructure, whether it's housing or whether it's other infrastructure that is built, how those decisions are made from a catchment-wide approach. For example, if new development takes place, at the moment, a water company is not a statutory consultee as part of any new development that takes place, which seems, completely bonkers, really, because it is the water company that is then faced with the consequences of having to deal with that runoff as the water enters into the combined sewage system, which then comes on to my next point, which is about grey water entering the system. And it's very easy, and I take this from my own constituency, for example, in Ilkley, where Yorkshire Water, quite rightly, have invested nearly about £30 million in Ilkley alone in terms of putting in hard infrastructure, in terms of increasing the capacity associated with storm overflow retention before it enters into the sewage treatment works. But if we were able to have better negotiations with landowners, whether it's that public land or private land, to have more nature-based solutions that effectively stops the water getting into the combined sewage system in the first place, then you're having less challenges with implications to do with water then getting back out at the other end through storm overflows. The system through a catchment-wide approach has got to be stopping the water getting into the system in the first place. And that's where I think there's, in essence, what I'd like to see from the new government is trying to get rid of that silo approach between government departments. And the final point I just want to make is, I do not think, because you referred to the Labour Party manifesto, the water bill that is proposed by the Labour Party doesn't even cover off half the points that they were mentioning in their manifesto, let alone the the enthusiastic approach that Steve Reed was taking in advance of the general election, simply saying every water company chief exec's likely to end up in the dock. They're not going to under their new water bill. It just doesn't go far enough based on the promises that he made.
You don't surprise me.
On that note, I'm afraid we're out of time, but thank you so much to our panellists for taking part. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to the Sustainable Nitrogen Alliance for sponsoring today's event. Do stay in the room for the next CEN event in 30 minutes. Thank you, everyone.
Team photo.
Yeah, absolutely.